Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. The first thing that I would like to talk about today is workload management. That sounds exciting, doesn't it? But it might be useful. So we know that workload is the teacher killer. It's the single biggest, or it's the most cited reason for teachers leaving the profession, is workload, beyond behaviour, interestingly. Yes, many people often think that it might be behaviour, or more generally the emotional stress of the role of being a teacher that leads many teachers to leave the profession. But no, in surveys, the most cited reason for teachers leaving the profession is indeed workload. There's just too much to do. And teacher trainers within schools and within universities are more than aware of this. So they do try to equip their trainees with strategies to help them manage and navigate the high workload so that hopefully they stay within the profession. I heard a statistic a few years ago that half of teachers quit within the first 5 years, which is astounding. I don't know whether that statistic still stands, but if it was true a few years ago, it's probably not far off now. Now, one strategy that's often given to new teachers or trainees to help them manage their workload, or more specifically to help them prioritise their workload, is the urgent important grid. So you've got urgent and important down the side, and urgent and important along the bottom, and this creates 4 spaces within your grid. You've got things that are urgent and important, and they should come near the top of your to-do list. You've got things that are urgent but not important. They should perhaps come second on your to-do list. Then you've got things that are important but not urgent. They can come in third place. And then finally, you've got things that are unimportant and aren't urgent, and which probably therefore don't need doing at all. So this sounds like a good way, on the face of it, to help navigate and prioritise your workload. You've got a million different tasks coming in, things that are competing for your attention, and using this urgent, important grid or matrix, you can start to figure out which things you should direct your attention to first. I've got a couple of problems with this, however. My first problem is, while it may be relatively easy to decide which things are urgent or not urgent, often things get sent through with deadlines, for example, or, you've even got that little exclamation mark button that you can press for urgent emails, or emails that require an urgent response, within Microsoft Office. So there are clear ways in which whether something is urgent can be communicated. So that's not a problem. Urgency isn't a problem. Usually that's clear. But how do you decide, as a trainee teacher, as someone who's new to the profession, what is important? So often this urgent important grid is bestowed upon new trainees, and then they say, off you go, that should help you prioritise your workload. But there's very little discussion about how trainees would decide whether something is important or not. And so I'm here to help. Now, much more experienced teachers far more experienced than me, they develop an expert intuition for what matters in education. They might not always be able to articulate it, but they know it. They know it within their core. They've got a really good grasp of what matters. But yes, it isn't always properly communicated to to trainees, to new teachers. And that might be partly because more experienced teachers are suffering from the curse of knowledge. They know it down to their bones, and so they might forget that new teachers don't know it. But anyway, here's a couple of things to bear in mind when trying to decide whether something is important or not. So, when trying to decide whether something's important, you should ask yourself 2 questions. First, will it improve the quality of my explanations? So if you're having to choose between spending a bit more time thinking about how you're going to explain that day's lessons and, doing some paperwork, then you should probably choose the former, because spending time thinking about how you're going to explain new concepts, how you're going to build a bridge between what students currently know and what they need to know, that's time that's very well spent as a teacher. That is important. Improving the clarity of explanations is a really important thing to do. So that's the first question you should ask yourself when deciding whether something is important. Will it improve the clarity of my explanations? The second question is, and this one often gets neglected, I think. So teachers will spend a lot of time, and rightly so, planning how they're going to explain things, which is great. But this next one does get neglected a little bit, and I think that it requires just as much, if not more, planning and preparation. So the second question is, when trying to decide whether something is important, is, will it make my students feel valued? So if you can direct your attention and your efforts towards things that are going to make your students feel valued, not only as students but as people, then that's also time very well spent. That's an important thing to do as a teacher, to think about how to make students feel valued. And it does often get overlooked a little bit in favour of the first question, the question of how to make explanations more clear and more concise and more compelling. But equally important is to think hard about how to make students feel valued. So there you go. You've got your grid, your urgent, important grid. And now, with those 2 questions in mind, it might be a little bit easier to think about which tasks and which jobs fall into which of those 4 quadrants. So when trying to decide whether something's important, ask yourself first and foremost, ask yourself first, I won't say foremost, but ask yourself first, will it improve the quality of my explanations? And second, will it make my students feel valued? Those, in my opinion, are the 2 criteria of whether something's important in education. However, I do have another problem with this urgent, important grid. I heard a story recently about how, I think it was the Mars rover. We've got robots on different planets now, haven't we? It's amazing. Well, it got to its planet, it got to its destination, and it got there and it had a little bit of a breakdown, bless it. It came to a halt, and scientists back here on Earth were struggling to figure out why. It just kind of stopped doing what it was doing. And they figured out eventually that they had programmed this robot with all sorts of different algorithms to help it prioritize what it should do first. And it was spending so much time running through these algorithms, trying to decide what mattered and what it should do first, that it ended up not doing anything at all. It just froze. It had the robot equivalent of analysis paralysis, which is something that I often suffer with. When trying to decide what to do, I might spend too much time thinking about which thing to do first and end up not doing anything at all. And so what they had to do with this robot is reprogram it so that if it hadn't come to a clear-cut answer after a certain amount of time, it just needed to pick something randomly and get going. Because after a certain amount of time, you're just wasting time. You're heading towards analysis paralysis. You should stop, and at that point it's better to do anything than nothing at all. So yes, this urgent, important matrix it can be useful. And remember that something's important in teaching if it improves the quality of your explanations or if it makes your students feel valued. So it can be important, but you might get to a stage where you're spending so much time thinking about how to prioritize your to-do list, which is a long one as a teacher. It's never ending, in fact. That's something you have to come to peace with quite soon as you enter the profession. Your to-do list will never be fully ticked off. But yes, you're in danger. You can be in danger of spending too long trying to organise and prioritise tasks, when in fact it might be better to stop thinking about what you should do first and just do anything. Pick something randomly. Because also, I mean, the scenario I'm talking about here is where you're probably trying to decide between a few different things to do, none of which are actually jumping out at you as being really important. So if something jumps out at you as being important, as satisfying those two criteria of either improving your explanations or making students feel valued, then obviously you should do that first. But as for the rest of the things that perhaps don't qualify as important, then don't spend too long torturing yourself over which to do first. It can be best just to pick one at random. There we go. Okay. I've one more thing to discuss today. First, however, my usual Patreon plea. This episode took around 2 hours to produce, which is about average, and I aim to produce 2 episodes a month. So if you think that work, around 4 hours a month from me, creating those podcast episodes, is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on the Patreon. And if you sign up on the Patreon, you'll help me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution is greatly appreciated. And you'll also gain exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions. So there's an additional little perk there to signing up to the Patreon. As always, I'll leave the link in the show notes. Thank you very much. Now, I wanted to talk about something, an incident, a behaviour incident that happened yesterday. It was poor behaviour on the part of the student. However, on reflection, it was also poor behaviour on the part of the teacher, namely me. So I was heading to a meeting shortly after lunch, and some students were taking their time to go to their lesson. They were still kicking a football about. And so, I encouraged them on their way, shouted to them to get going. I wasn't shouting in their faces, but they were a fair distance from me, so I was having to kind of shout at them. They were moving towards me. So I was shouting to them, "Let's get going to our lessons, lads. Hurry up, pick the ball up. I don't want to have to take it off you, all the usual stuff. Let's get going." And one student gave me the dirtiest look. It was an amazing face, an amazing look. This student would make a wonderful actor, I think. So this real dirty look, and I responded negatively. I'd have said something along the lines of, "What's the issue? Do you have a problem? Are we going to our lessons? What's wrong? Why are you looking at me like that?" Something, I was confrontational. Let's put it that way. And with hindsight, I'd imagine the look on my face might have been just as dirty, just as a nasty, contorted look on my face as well. So we were probably looking at each other and seeing this, this nasty face at both ends looking at one another. And then a few more words were exchanged. I felt that his attitude was very poor, and he ended up walking away from me. I ended up shouting after him, "Okay, well, we'll discuss this after school then. Don't worry, I'll make a phone call home and I'll make sure that we can have this detention after school where we get to the bottom of this, because, this isn't on." And I was angry. I was really quite angry. And anyway, he and his friends went off to their lesson. And I sat on a bench for a moment, and I went on to Sims, and I was going to pull up his details and and phone home and have a real moan. And basically, I was going to get my own back. I really didn't like the way he'd looked at me first and foremost, and then the way he'd spoken to me afterwards. And I'm a teacher. I'm meant to be some sort of authority figure, apparently. And that's not the way you should interact with me as respect. I deserve respect. Blah blah blah. So I was sat there annoyed, and I tried to pause. Just for a minute, because I could tell the main thing that was driving my behaviour in that moment, where I was going to pull up his details, ring home, have a right moan, make sure that he was going to be collected after school for detention, all this stuff. It was all being driven by anger. And if I'm honest, a desire for revenge. I felt I'd been slighted, disrespected, and I wanted vengeance. And anyway, I was late for my meeting by this point, so I stopped that. I stopped what I was doing. I went to my meeting, had a lovely meeting, and then I was walking back towards the other end of the school, and I'd calmed down. My blood was no longer so hot. I was no longer seeking vengeance. And I went and found the student in his current lesson, asked if I could speak to him. He came outside, we spoke, and he was probably expecting a real telling off, or for me to tell him, I have spoken to your parents now. They're not happy with you. You're doing a DT with me after school, all this negative stuff. And I managed to avoid all that. So I brought him out and I said, I don't think either of us handled that situation very well. I think that both of us reacted more angrily than the situation needed. And I think there was a lot of miscommunication between the pair of us. So I think we both got it wrong. I'd like to draw a line under it, if you're happy to do that, which he was. He was very happy to do that. I shook his hand and he went back into his lesson, and that was the end of it. And I was really happy with that resolution, and I wanted to share it with you because there are times when on reflection I have found myself acting out of a desire for vengeance against a student. I feel sometimes students, poor behaviour, I feel disrespected, and I want to get my own back. And I think that if I'd have let that emotion yesterday dictate what I did, it would have prolonged the negativity, and I don't know whether it would have resulted in any lasting change in either his behaviour or mine. So I'm really happy with hindsight that I had that meeting that I was late to and I needed to get to, and that gave me the time to kind of just calm down, basically. We give students time to process their emotions before trying to have a restorative conversation with them. Sometimes we might give them they might have a 5-minute pass to go and calm down outside. We give students that space, but I think it's important to remember to give ourselves that space as well. So yes, here's the moral of the story, and it's something that I'm going to keep in the forefront of my mind moving forward. If you ever feel like you're acting out of a desire for vengeance against a certain student who you feel has disrespected you or slighted you in some way, then it might be better to pause and give yourself a little bit of time to calm down, to process the emotions, and then return to the situation just a little while later. If you have that opportunity, to give yourself a bit of space. Now, it might turn out that the student still requires a phone call home and an after-school DT, but at least the decision won't have been made while you were kind of hot with emotion. Emotions are good things. Emotions help us decide what we value, what we don't value. But often they can run away with us as well. It's important to have rationality and emotions going hand in hand, especially in these sorts of situations, which could kind of make or break a relationship with a student. So there you go. That's the moral. If you ever feel like you're out for revenge, then maybe take a few steps back and a few deep breaths. Give yourself a bit of space and time to figure out whether you're going about it in the right way. That's something I'm going to try and do, definitely, moving forward. I'm going to try and do that more. Thank you for listening today. If you have any thoughts on anything that's been discussed, then please do get in touch and let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And we'll talk again in a few weeks' time. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you and talk again soon.